Alright, so hello everyone and welcome to another edition of SpraynPray1000's The Verdict. I am SpraynPray1000 and welcome to the first episode of 2017. Today we are going to talk about the latest in the long-running line of horror games, Resident Evil 7 Biohazard. So just to basically start off, this game, unlike most other Resident Evil games, which are generally third-person, action, survival horror hybrid games, this game takes extreme measures to go back to the original idea and implementation of Resident Evil. That feeling of survival horror, that feeling of isolation, that feeling of having a nice atmosphere that really contributes to the sort of thing that what survival horror should be about. And because of that, the game plays moderately differently from other Resident Evils. There's some things here or there that are very similar, but at the same time, there's a lot of things that are also changed drastically. I apologize for that. To compensate for that. So, for instance, this game is played from a first-person perspective, not something that's necessarily new to the Resident Evil franchise, but at the very least, it's something that has not really been done super heavily before in the Resident Evil series. I can think of Resident Evil Dead Aim, Resident Evil The Umbrella Chronicles, and then the later release of the Dark Side Chronicles. And otherwise, generally first-person shooting segments are relegated to like on-rails portions or sniping in other Resident Evil games and such and such. This game plays entirely from the first-person perspective. Additionally, you do not play as anyone that has already been pre-established in the Resident Evil series, a super fighter, kind of like Chris Redfield punching stuff and, punching boulders and whatnot. For the most part, you play as Ethan Winters, a generic guy who was out looking for his lost wife who disappeared for 3 years in the Louisiana swamp of Dulve, Louisiana, and as predicted, things really go to hell, things go wrong, and Ethan is forced to fight for his life while searching for his wife and doing other things. And no, I do not try to come up with these sick rhymes. I do not pre-plan it. It just sort of happens. What to talk about first? I think the first thing I'll talk about is, again, I did this on a previous verdict. I don't remember what verdict. But I'm going to talk about the graphics first. The graphics of this game are pretty sweet. Like, they're not super hyper amazing realistic, but they are there somewhat. I'd say that it's the people that don't look very realistic, but the atmosphere and the environments look basically what I would expect from something like what they were trying to go for. So a rundown house in the middle of nowhere in a swampy, foresty area. Yeah, they pretty much nailed it right on the head. I wouldn't say that, it's out of place or anything. The number one thing I will praise this game for, that it gets a gold star for in my opinion, is the lighting. The lighting in this game is near flawless in my mind. The lighting really contributes to just about every aspect of this game. There were a few times where I literally jumped at my shadow because the lighting, when I was turning, was just that crazy. It was just that good. So I will say this, graphically, this game feels like a next generation game. I mean, of course, now it's the current generation, but it feels there. It feels like when you walk around these areas and you don't know what kind of monsters or anything are waiting for you, that's the kind of stuff that I want to see. And while it isn't, super ironclad and perfect, it hits the job so well. I can't help but really say that, damn, at least presentation-wise, this game has it made. It has it set up. It has it ready to roll. And I really like that about this game because that's what makes survival horror good, in my opinion. That you can have something like that and it really contributes. And I remember back in the day with Dead Space, I said, damn, this game, sure, it has a little bit of a cartoony look a little bit, and but at least the atmosphere is well constructed. And I'm not, if you were to play this game at night in a dark room, with headphones, you would be scared, I feel. I honestly feel that way about some games, and this is one of those games because of what they did with the presentation. The soundtrack, I mean, it's a horror game, so there's not like any heavy rock music or anything playing. Now, that's not to say Resident Evil has never had soundtracks during action points, but the soundtrack of this game is basically, you know, like, I can't make this desk creak, but it's like creaking wood, like bangs and stuff, you know, just when you're walking around this mansion, or even when you're just standing still. You know, they'll have these things that contribute to the atmosphere that just strike home beautifully. There were several times when I was in my item box, or I was, you know, talking about something, and all of a sudden to my right there'd be a bang or something, or there would be like a creaking, like someone was trying to creep up behind you, you know what I mean? So the sense of paranoia and isolation given by the graphics and the soundtrack is magnificent. It's spot on. You really feel isolated and alone. And I mean, of course, if you play this game with like 5 people around you, then you wouldn't. But like, if you play this game, like, you know, most horror games I assume are meant to be played by yourself, it's frightening. It's perplexing. It's very in-depth in the sense that it's crazy how much it can really get to you, how important it is for a survival horror game to have stuff like this. And this is the kind of stuff that I liked about Silent Hill 2, is that when you play, and 2, more or less 3 as well, is that when you're alone, and I'm not just talking like you're just one dude running around a map killing zombies or whatever, like when you actually have that sense of isolation, it really augments the game in ways that just basic gameplay might not be able to do. And that's why it's so important, and this game strikes home beautifully. I guess we'll talk about the story, because I like the story of Resident Evil. I know I'm a fool, but Resident Evil 7 takes place after the events of Resident Evil 6. Like I said before, you're not playing as any of the previously defined characters. So Ethan is a very, you know, typical guy. He's an average dude who just wants to find what happened to his wife when she went missing and all that. I'll say this, the story has its twists and turns, which is interesting. I really feel, though, like the middle portion of this game doesn't really have a ridiculous amount of stuff to bite on. I feel like the main meat of the game is either presented to you at the beginning and at the end, you know, towards the end, which is fine. It's just that the story isn't super engaging, I want to say. It sort of takes a back roll a little bit when you're playing through the game, and because of that, I mean, it's a little weak. It's not as strong as I would have liked, but it's still pretty good the way it's done. Now, one other thing I want to say is that unlike other Resident Evil games, and a lot of survival horror games do this, Resident Evil 7 starts off in that really creepy kind of an area. You know, you don't know what's going on. You're literally in an area that I feel like most people that are, you know, would play this game don't live in like a rundown house in the middle of nowhere. You know, it's that alien kind of feeling of the environment that really drives it home even more so. Resident Evil 7, unlike games like Evil Within, Resident Evil 4, Resident Evil 1, essentially almost any previous Resident Evil, it never loses that feeling of horror you get from the start. So like by the end of it, the start of Resident Evil 4, you're in a village with a bunch of random Spaniards that are trying to kill you. By the end of the game, you're on a military island fighting off trained troops. You know what I mean? It loses that sense of being in a village of crazy people trying to kill you with pitchforks and knives and stuff. Resident Evil 1, you're in this mansion filled with zombies. Like, I would say that literally started the whole idea of a kind of zombie-filled mansion for video gaming. I mean, I could think of a couple of different games that literally took off from that. But by the end of the game, you've completely ditched the mansion for a underground laboratory where it's just, the feel is different. And I'm not saying that it's not scary anymore, but the feel of it changes from being in like what would be someone's house and home, into just kind of like, okay, you're gunning people up in like this obviously unnatural location. Like it loses the feel and the touch. Evil Within especially, at the start, is very terrifying because you don't know what's going on and because all this crazy stuff is happening. But by the end of it, I mean, again, not to say that's not scary, but you're just kind of fighting dudes with assault rifles in an urban environment. It kind of loses that feeling. So, yeah, I mean, definitely with regards to that, this game never really does that, I feel. I mean, there is a point where it kind of gets a little bit, more action-y and a little bit more of everything, but it never loses that feeling of isolation and atmospheric terror. And because of that, I really like that about this game. This game knows it's supposed to be a horror game. It is kind of almost, I want to say, like Silent Hill 2. It really feels like when you play this game is like the less supernatural between Silent Hill 2 and this game. It's really like nice the way they implemented all of that to give a good feel. You never end up in like some ridiculous like city where you're shooting dudes in military suits. That never happens in this game. And I really respect that greatly. So the story, kind of takes a little bit of a backseat role this time around. But on the flip side, the story of this game is at least very fun. It's very interesting. I definitely want to see what happens. There's a lot of Easter eggs and a couple of tie-ins to the Resident Evil mainstay series, and it'll be interesting to see how they augment or change that up as time goes on. I guess now what I'll talk about is the gameplay. So like I said, the atmospheric sensation of being alone and being scared never really leaves. But what about the gameplay? Just to start, the gameplay of this game is a first-person shooter. You never really leave first person when you're playing the game, which is fine. I won't say it plays poorly, because it certainly doesn't play poorly. Ethan is kind of an average person in the sense that really all he has to kind of fight against stuff with is the fact that he has aiming. He can do a bunch of stuff, but there's no like quick time events in this game. There's no action-packed sequences. You really don't gain anything from meleeing a boss down like other Resident Evils, where you shoot them, you make them stutter, and then you run in and you get a melee hit, for extra damage. That system is kind of gone. This game does have a fair bit of combat. I won't, that is definitely present in this game. But don't expect anything like Resident Evil 5. As they actually said, don't expect a gun fest. But, yeah, I mean, guns play a heavy part in the combat. But because Ethan doesn't run that quickly, because he doesn't really, outpace certain enemies, you kind of have to know the difference between fight and flight a little bit. There's parts of the game where you're being chased by invincible enemies, and while you can stun them and, kind of deal with them, it's, you're trying to solve puzzles while avoiding them, and believe me, they will follow you. They are not too stupid, which also in and of itself kind of lends itself to the horror element. That there's something out there in this part of the game, that's kind of like stalking you, and you don't know where they are, and you're trying to solve puzzles so you can progress, but at the same time you got to check behind every corner. You got to peek through doors before you bulldoze through them, kind of like what Resident Evil used to do a little bit, and then really wasn't much of a point. Like earlier Resident Evils, you could specifically like 4 and 5, you could open doors slowly to see what's on the other side. Generally what ends up happening is that most people just kick them down. That really never changed after a certain point. Most people just kick doors down and call it a day. But this game, there actually is a point to looking through a door to see to see what's on the other side. This game handles that very nicely. Additionally, the gunplay is pretty good. I feel like, unlike Resident Evil 6, where ammo was a problem, ironically, the more survival horror of the two doesn't really have that problem as much. You actually kind of have more than enough to really kind of deal with anything that comes along your way. And, yeah, I mean, that is what, in my opinion, makes Resident Evil 7 very, very fun. It makes it very, very interesting. And the fact that it balances combat and horror so well is remarkable. Now, what I didn't like about this game is I would say that some of the more disappointing aspects of the game, I feel, are just the lack of variety of enemies. There's really only, I want to say, like, other than bosses, like maybe 5 different enemy types in the game, and only like 2 of them are really prevalent for most of the game, which is fine, but you know, there's not really, like, combat starts to almost feel like a chore a little bit, because you're basically fighting the same kind of enemies over and over and over. And that's one thing that I will give to the older style survival horror games, is that at the very least, when you're prancing around and you're trying to kill stuff or whatever, at the very least, all the different areas, like, the enemies, you have to deal with them differently. Like in this game, it's basically variations on one type of enemy for the most part, and that's basically it. Additionally, the boss fights kind of are a little bit boring and repetitive, especially since it seems like a fair chunk of the boss fights seem to be reworked versions of older bosses from other Resident Evil games. Again, not something that's wholly a negative, but at the same time, it is a little bit harrowing, I guess, to just kind of fight bosses, and they basically have the same kind of weak points, the same kind of repetitive stuff, and more or less, I would almost say that the bosses kind of turn into suspense killers a little bit. Like, at the very least, I'll say that there was one boss halfway through in a greenhouse that was real nice, and I thought that one was a little bit different and a little bit more innovative, but then it just seems like the remainder of them are just kind of, whatever. It is what it is. You have to fight them eventually, right? Now, there are a few things about the plot that are kind of a bit unclear, and I feel like there needs to be more explanation in the game about, where this fits in, because they've already stated this is not a reboot. This is a legitimate sequel. And while they do have free DLC coming out to explain that, I just feel like for the sake of the main scenario, they should have probably had it in the game to begin with. I really kind of dislike the idea that not even a week after the game dropped, they're having DLC for it. That, to me, kind of screams cut content, especially from Capcom, and the story could have benefited from having a little bit more cohesiveness with the remainder of the series, which I presume is what they're going for, especially since they have such a large branch of story to even work with to begin with. I also think that there's some items in this game that are kind of worthless. The separating agent, I only ever found one in the entire game. I feel like they load you down too much on certain items while not giving you enough. While I like the crafting system, I feel like they could have maybe thrown a little bit more at you to kind of help you out, or at least more diverse amounts of stuff. But I mean, all in all, it's not a terrible thing to have around. It's just, I don't know. I feel like certain aspects, certain minor things about this game could have been improved to kind of make it better. And while it is a satisfying, fun horror game that really kind of draws on its roots, I think that parts of it could really be patched up a little bit more. Really makes me wonder what they're going to do for future Resident Evils, if they're going to stick with this formula, if they're going to go back to the old formula, if they're going to specifically branch off and maybe make one type of Resident Evil and another type. And it really reminds me what Revelations was supposed to have been. This game, I mean, basically is what Revelations was sold as to be. It was supposed to be a classic sort of survival horror way of dealing about things, but it ended up just kind of being a mix between classic and modern. This game definitely goes way back to classic while staying a modern game, which is nice because usually old school gaming and modern gaming don't usually congeal very well because of the, just the mechanics and stuff involved. Other than that, I mean, the only other thing I think is really a problem are the puzzles. I thought that the puzzles in this game were reasonably simple. There's one puzzle with photo frames that the answer is literally on the other side of the room. There's no methodology, no thinking behind it. There's another puzzle where to fix up clocks, and it's just like, all right. I mean, there wasn't really much. And to be fair, Resident Evil has had really lax puzzles for a while anyway. So I mean, this is not like it's something that is only inherently new to this game. Resident Evil has had kind of really lax puzzles, but if it's going to try to be classic Resident Evil, the puzzles were always a big part of that, and I really feel like they needed to bring a little more into that. But I digress, and I don't want to detract from the fact that this is what I would say the de facto horror game of the 8th generation of consoles. It definitely gets up there. It gets a standing ovation from me for its atmosphere, for the sense of isolation, the sense of paranoia it instills in you. And while it isn't a perfect experience, it's still one of the more fun experiences I've had in a while. It's still definitely one of the better survival horror experiences I've done in a while. And on top of that, I just really like the fact that this game, despite being vastly different from its predecessors, still manages to be a good game. And that's what really drives it home, is that this game is so different from everything else that's come before in Resident Evil, yet it still manages to be better than some of the other Resident Evil games that have ever come out. It's not the best, I would say, but it still manages to be up there on that list pretty high, you know? And that means a lot, because a lot of times you see games come out with stuff and it is just like you have no clue where they got this from. It's just crazy, and that's what I've seen with a lot of franchises along the way, even from Capcom. That just do crazy stuff that's outlandish. But this game nails it beautifully. So what would I give Resident Evil 7? I'm going to give Resident Evil 7 a 90 out of 100. As I said, the survival horror aspect of this game cannot be stressed. It's very well done. It's magnificent. It's a load of fun. It's a blast. Again, main criticisms being some stale elements, I guess I'll put it as. Basically, the problem with a game like this is because the gameplay doesn't really change that much. Those stale elements, I feel, accumulate a little more. They have a little more dead, in quotes, weight to the game. So repetitive bosses, a crafting system that needs a little more rounding, and enemy variety and stuff that carries a little bit more weight in a game that is this short. Resident Evil games are usually short, but a game that's this short, it's reasonably simple to kind of get through. And just compared to like other Resident Evil games, like I'll say like Resident Evil 3, right? Resident Evil 3 had randomized enemies, randomized items, it had a lot of crazy stuff going on, but at the same time it had a crafting system that was interesting and all that other kind of stuff. It needs to reach that level, and then maybe I'll be like, all right, that's different, that's okay. But yeah, that and the lore and whatnot is all good. So I really, really, really can't wait to see what they do. I mean, it'll probably be a couple of years before we even hear anything new about Resident Evil, but when they do, I'm game. So that's it for me. I'm SpraynPray1000. I'll see you guys next time.